Torah D'Rabim, Talmud Torah D'Yachid, Ani Sar Tzeva Hashem, Ata Bati. Which one was the greater Aveira? So the Gemara concludes that Talmud Torah D'Rabim outweighed the Bittul Tamid Shel Bein Harbayim. And so, even if it was true that one could draw a Kal V'chomer from Bittul Avoda to Bittul Talmud Torah, that would only be true at the level of Talmud Torah of Yachid. That's Kal V'chomer of Beis Rebbe. So to pick it up where we had left off, Udi Yachid Kal, is it really so that Talmud Torah the Yachid is to be taken lightly with respect to Mikra Megillah? That's not Nashim b'Moed. Moed means here Chol Moed Ma'anos Avlo Metapchos. These are various practices in the context of Avelos. Rabbi Shmuel Omer Mahayu Semuchos Limita Metapchos. That if they're close to the actual Aron, the dead body, they can even be Metapchos. Rashi explains that Ma'anos is Hesped. Metapchos is to not to injure themselves, but to be to clap over their hearts. Those they could do both. Bazeh mikonidos. Okay. Amar Rabba Barhuna ein moed b'fnei Talmid Chacham kol sheken Chanukah uPurim. So this is the important part of the statement. So Rabba Barhuna says that the Chol HaMoed, as important as is in general, and there would be an Isser Hesped in general, when it comes to a Talmid Chacham, so that does not get in the way. So the Gemara is, trying to ask a question about. Well, you can see from this context that Talmud Torah the Yachid is going to be Docha Purim. We just take a look over at Tosfos for a second. Kol sheken Chanukah uPurim. That Tosfos Shemuter laspid and afagav de mevatel Mikra Megillah. Alma Talmud Torah Chamor mimikra Megillah. So it's a little bit of a funny question because this isn't Talmud Torah per se. And that's indeed what the Gemara answers. The Gemara says, no, we're not talking about Talmud Torah, we're talking about Kavod Torah Kamar. Kavod Torah D'Yachid Chamor, Talmud Torah D'Yachid Kal. That when you're dealing with the Hesped of a Talmud Chacham, you're not talking about Talmud Torah per se, you're talking about Kavod Torah. And Kavod Torah is a sufficiently significant halachic factor to take precedence, the way that Tosfos explains it, even over Mikra Megillah. Rav Rosenzweig would always highlight the idea that the reason that we're going to be more permissive with respect to a Hesped of a Talmud Chacham on these various days, with Chanukah, Purim, Rosh Chodesh, Chol HaMoed, is specifically because it is a variety of Talmud Torah. And that would explain the Havamina in this Gemara very clearly. The Gemara's Havamina is that, well, it's synonymous with Talmud Torah D'Yachid, and the Gemara says, well, it's not exactly the same. Kavod Torah D'Yachid is going to trump Mikra Megillah, but not Talmud Torah D'Yachid. But the entire premise of the question is that the Hesped for a Talmud Chacham is a version of Talmud Torah, and he would articulate that very often. And the truth is, it really is, right? Because a person becomes synonymous with Torah, and Torah and the person are inextricably linked. The Gemara Rava statement comes to mind, Hani Bavli Tipshai, how foolish people can sometimes be. They stand up for a Sefer Torah, they don't stand up for a Talmud Chacham. The idea is that a Talmud Chacham becomes the personification of Talmud Torah.
Zachary Cohn, please come.
That's a very important idea. The first Mizmor Tehillim is cited by the Gemara Avodah Zarah in conjunction with this. Kim b'soras Hashem chefzo u'v'soraso yehege yomam v'layla. The process is such that it starts off as Toras Hashem, is the chefza, and then there's a merging between the chefza and the gavra. Kim b'soras Hashem chefzo u'v'soraso. But then the possessive, Torah Shalo, Yege Yoma Balai, that's a lifelong process. That's a very important, this Gemara is a particularly important Gemara in connection with that theme that I heard so often from Rav Rosenzweig. Which is also, I just wanted to add in this one point, which is basically the way he understood the Gemara in Brachos Daf Vav, which you guys learned last year, of Gadol Shimusha Yoser Milimuda. How can the Gemara possibly say that being Misharis a Talmud Chacham is more important than Talmud Torah? So that he would understand, that's the example of Elisha ben Shaphat, who poured water over the hands of Eliyahu. So what does the Gemara mean when it says that? Well, if you appreciate and understand that Eliyahu wasn't just a person, but he was, a walking Sefer Torah, the idea is that being Misharis, a walking Sefer Torah, affords you, new perspectives in Torah, that it's a din really intrinsic to Talmud Torah itself. Okay, so Amarava Pshita li Avoda Mikra Megillah Adif Mid Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. Remember on Amar Aleph, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina said Mishpacha Mishpachos kahuna levia. And remember, I brought you in on that topic of to what extent to regard the Levium as engaged in avoda, or would we call it a form of sheirus or malacha? Rashi in Perek Tes of Sefer Bamidbar, Zos Asher LaLeviim. Rashi says Zos Asher LaLeviim Shanim Poslin Bahem Ve'ein Mumin Poslin Bahem, that they're not Kohanim, they're not subject to Baal Mum, that only Shanim are posel. So that's a very interesting discussion about what extent Leviim are involved in avoda, mishpachos kuna levia. This Gemara certainly sounds like it's a variety of avoda. Pshitali avoda, mikra Megillah adif. Yosi Rabbi Chanina Talmud Torah Mikra Megillah Adif Midei Samchu Shel Beis Rabbi, right? As Beis Rabbi was Mevatel Talmud Torah for the purposes of Mikra Megillah. Talmud Torah Meis Mitzvah Adif Midei Tanya Mevatlin Talmud Torah Lohotzas HaMeis Ulachnasas Kala. There you have it, right? Even though that statement seems more general, Hotzas HaMeis is any mace, not just a Meis Mitzvah. That'd be Kal V'chomer to Meis Mitzvah. Avodah Meis Mitzvah Adif Mila Achoso. The pasuk says in the context of the Nazir that he's not allowed to be metame for any of his krovim, so why do I have to specify achoso? Tanya achoso ma talmud lo maharei shayaholich lishchot et pischo lambu aspeno shamash shemes lameis yachol yitama amarta lo yitama. So the nazir cannot become tamei. Yach shem shena metame lachoso kachem tam beis mitzvah talmud lo mar lachoso. I mean, once you know you can't be metame for the shiva krovim, why did Torah to specify lachoso? So it's a way of an inference, right? If he can't be metame lachoso, there surely must be somebody else he can be metame for lachoso de metame. Metamihu lemeis mitzvah. Ba'irava. Next question. Mikra Megillah meis mitzvah. Hai minayu adif. Mikra Megillah adif mishum persume nisa. Oduma meis mitzvah adif mishum kavod abrios. So Basar Debayi hadar pashta. So Rabba posed the question, but then he immediately answered it. So clearly meis mitzvah adif. Tamar gadol kavod abrios shedochas losa se Shabbat Torah. Kavod abrios is docha losa se Shabbat Torah. This is the pasuk of lo suchali salem, the context of Hashavas Aveda, and zmanim shat mis'alem mehem. The Gemara says that there are times that we override this lo saseh Shabbat Torah b'shei val taseh when we instruct the zaken. It's eno lefi chvodo. Rabbi Chatzin never applied this Gemara to himself. He always thought it was lefi chvodo, to return a lost object. He would very often be on the floor looking for things with us. I guess there is at least he just didn't apply the Gemara to himself, but there is a halachic category called zaken of eno lefi chvodo, that person who's achieved a certain stature, it's not mechubad for him to be involved in lo suchali salem in certain kinds of aveda issues. So be that as it may, that's a relatively minor issue of kavod habrios. Meis mitzvah is the ultimate issue of kavod habrios. The ultimate issue of kavod habrios is certainly kavod habrios is going to be docha mikra Megillah. The fact that Rava could have even posed such a question is really a feather in the cap of mikra Megillah, right? You're asking head to head, meis mitzvah versus anything, and you're asking the question in a serious way. That says a lot about Mikra Megillah, right? The Rambam's iteration of this, as I pointed out to a number of you in the morning, is very fascinating, because the Rambam basically does take the view that Meis Mitzvah is Docha Mikra Megillah, but not entirely, right? Because the Rambam says, and then you come back later and you do Mikra Megillah, right? It doesn't seem like the Rambam deals with the zero-sum case. Gufa. Where we had left off, we said that the krach is the satellite environs as well. Tanya samach b'shen nira nira b'sheno samach bishlam nira b'sheno samach. We can imagine a case where it's visible but not necessarily close. Mishkach is called diasva b'rosh hahar. Right, if you're dealing with a krach on top of a mountain, right, so that you have a tremendous visibility. So the visibility will go greater than samach. Again, how do we define samach in this context? 2,000 amos, right? Mil mechamas l'tveria mil. But what about the opposite case? A little bit of a funny line in the Gemara, I do have to admit. So bishlam nira afal b'sheno samach mishpachas like you go to yasva b'roshahar l'samach afal b'sheno nira heichi mishkachas. How could it possibly be close without being visible? So Rabbi Yirmiyah sheyosheves benachal. So Rabbi Yirmiyah says, by the way, you could have it if if it's down in a valley. So it could be right below, but you just can't possibly see it. It was a settled place. Uvasof hukaf, and then a wall was added later. Nidon kikfar. It doesn't have the din of a kfar. It has the din of a kfar. So Tosfos points out here. You just take the last line of this Tosfos, long Tosfos of krach sheyasha vasof hukaf nidon kikfar. But Tzarech Lomar, last line of that Tosfos, the had kamri nidon kikfar. Mayri deleka asara batlanim. We'll get to that halacha in a second. Why is it immediately demoted to a kfar? Why can't it just go through the intermediate stage of being a big city? to be a kfar is a little surprising. So Tosfos to say dafka like a kfar. But really important halacha here is that nidon kikfar. If it was a city and only then was a wall added, they had an infrastructure project and they built a wall, a gigantic wall, right? So that would still not turn it into a krach. My time at the pasuk says v'ish ki yimkar beis moshav ir choma, that it always had the status of ir choma shehukla v'sof yashav v'lo sheyashav l'sof hukav, that the wall has to be from the very founding of the city. Now, as Machogas Rashi Tosfos here, what's the significance? In which area of halacha are we speaking? So Rashi says there's only a din in Bate Arechoma, and Tosfos says it applies to Mikra Megillah as well. Anybody know the din of Bate Arechoma? What's Rashi referring to? V'ish ki yimkor beis moshav Yerchoma yamim tiagulaso. That unlike any other property that you sell, which returns in the Yovel, and which you can redeem at any time, Bate Arechoma, if you sell something in a walled city, a domicile in the walled city, you have a year to redeem it. If at that point you do not redeem it, you have no future opportunity to redeem it. It's not choser b'yovel. So that it would be, that would only be in a base moshav ir choma, but again, as defined, this is Rashi's reading, as defined by having a wall to begin with. Tosfos says no, the reason we're discussing a Masechus Megillah, it applies equally to Mikra Megillah. Okay. Amar Bishom and Levi krach shein bo asar batlanim didon kekfar. My kamash mulan tanina ezo yer gedola kol sheyesh bo asar batlanim pachos mikana reize kvar. Krach itzrichle avogav de mikloi le me alma. So this I wanted to drill down to a little bit. What's the difference between an ear and a kfar? Remember the kfar, remember makdim liyom aknisin, the yidal fi beis gimel. Yer gedola has asar batlanim. So that's the difference. And a krach, you might think that you don't need asara batlanim, but you still do need asara batlanim. And even if it's a walled city and there's people coming from all over, if there aren't asara batlanim, it has the din of a kfar. That really does require some analysis. I mean, what exactly does this mean? Asara batlanim have the capacity to transform a village into a great municipality, or the absence thereof, so to speak, demote the halachic status of that location. So let's take a look at how Rashi defines asara batlanim. Rashi says asara batlanim betelim imlachtan shir mitzuyin tamid veis hakneses shach so arvis kedavinim mesachas brachos kivan sheba kadosh baruch hu veis hakneses lo matzah sham asara. The Gemara's concluding statement is miyad koes. Fascinating. So that to have 10 people in shul at all times, you would think there's a specific halacha in minyan, but the way that the Rashi presents it is that it should be really almost at all times. B'teilim melachta, these individuals are the representatives of the community in the Beis HaKnesses. Normally, when we think about that Gemara on Brachos Tavav and Beis about Kadosh Baruch Hu coming to check out whether there's a minyan, you'd think it's in the context of Tefillah B'tzibur. But here it's just defined much more expansively. And the very fact that this will be the line of demarcation as to whether something is an ear or something is a kvar is just absolutely remarkable. Now, what was the Havamina as far as a krach not needing that? So Rashi explains, krach it's tzrichale, the whole krach, eno lamakom shvakim, by definition the business portal, shenechnasim shami kol tzad, gadol hu yosim yirgdola, de mikloi le me'alma, nashim harbe, v'ish harbe men b'telim lachtan, shenosim lachol mikolman, afilu hachi ba'inan kevuin, the zimnin de lo mishtachchin. So the Havamina essentially was, since a krach is a metropolis, international center, and people are always there are always going to be 10 people available for a minyan. Right? So this is exactly getting back to the issue we were talking about before. If it's just having 10 people available, for sure in a krach, there are 10 people who aren't involved in work at any time. You can always get together a minyan. But the idea is having people who are kavuim lakach, people who are absolutely set aside for this purpose, and that's what defines it, halachically speaking, as an ear as opposed to a kfar. Okay. Next halacha. Amar bishom levi krach shecharav ulavasof yashav nidon kikrach. It still has the din of a krach. So my charav, what does it mean? There's destroyed. So if you're telling me that the walls were destroyed, So what difference would that make? Yashav in lo yashav lo, v'atani Reb Elazar bar Yossi Omer, asher lo chom alfa pi she'en lo achshav v'haya lakodem lachein. So the Gemara says is as long as it was a walled city, mimos Yoshua ben Nun, so we're not interested in whether or not it has walls now. Elamai charav. So what do we mean when we say that the city was destroyed? Shecharav me'asar batlanim. That it temporarily lost the 10 batlanim. So that's Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi's comment here. Krach shecharav of sof yashav nidon kikrach. It can have its status as a krach reinstated as long as it's able to reestablish asar batlanim. Shecharav me'asar batlanim. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. This is just some historical information about various cities in the land of Israel. 1, Lod. 2, Ono. Geha Charashim. 3, Mukavas Chomi Moshe Yoshua ben Nun. Hevu. So then the Gemara says, V'hani Yoshua bananhi. Did Yoshua really build these 3 cities? V'ha El Pa'el bananhi. Rather, it was El Pa'el, historical figure. Dichsiv u'bnei El Pa'el. This was Divrei Hayamim. Eber u'misham v'shamayr. Hu banas Ono v'eslod u'bno Seha. We say Asa bananhi, but you could just as easily make the argument that Asa, much later figure in Jewish history, was the one that built them. Dechsiv vayiven Asa arei habtzuris asher liyuda. Amar Reb Elazar. So Reb Elazar explains what the sequence of events was. Hani mukavas chami Moshe Yoshua ben Nun. Charav bimei Pilegesh begiva. These are all in the tribal area of Binyamin. You guys all know the story of Pilegesh begiva, where there was a civil war and Binyamin was almost completely annihilated. V'asa El Pa'el bananhi. El Pa'el then came along and built them again. Hadar Inpol, then they fell into disrepair. Asa. So Asa came along and Shaptzinhu, and he improved them. Deganami dechsiv v'yomer liyuda nifnes ha'arim ha'ela michlal de'erim hevu meikara shmamina. Okay, so basically these were cities that were from the time of Yoshua ben Nun, and they were subsequently destroyed, and then they were rebuilt on a variety of different locations, different occasions. Now, one point just here that I wanted to communicate to you from Tosfos without seeing the whole thing inside is Tosfos of the view that a city which is actually a krach, mimos Yoshua ben Nun, does not require asara baklanim. And in that way, a krach really is different than in Ir Gedola. That's the view that Tosfos takes on a number of different occasions on this particular Amud. Okay, so just to summarize what we saw today, we spoke about the interrelationship between Kavod Torah in terms of a hesped of a Talmud Chacham and Talmud Torah. The Gemara sees them as deeply related. Ultimately, we draw a distinction between the two, and we say that Kavod Torah in terms of a hesped of Talmud Chacham would be docha to an extent. Mikra Megillah, whereas Talmud Torah Diyachid isn't, but the fact that Gemara could have raised the question is very suggestive. Then we said that Mikra Megillah and Meis Mitzvah are sort of the two greatest halachic values left standing, and we agree that Meis Mitzvah is going to be docha Mikra Megillah because Meis Mitzvah is docha lo saseh Shabbat Torah. I mentioned the Rambam's view that even Meis Mitzvah isn't completely docha Mikra Megillah. It just means that you're allowed to delay Mikra Megillah for a period of time. Then we started again to define krach, and we said it has to have an ir choma before it was settled. There's a din of asara batlanim, the relevance of asara batlanim in terms of establishing an ir, which is a very fascinating topic. What makes it an ear is not how tall the skyscrapers are, but how committed the ear is to a particular ethos. The ethos of Kadosh Baruch Hu ba lo matzah asar beis hakneses miad koes. We noted the simple reading of the Gemara was that krach would also require asar batlanim. And Tosfos goes in a different direction with respect to that particular point. And then we had the halach in the Gemara that in ear was mukav chomi most of Yoshua ben Nun and lost its choma would not lose its status as a krach. Okay, very good. So we'll pick it up with the halach of Nashim Mikra Megillah tomorrow.